On the evening of January 3, 1977, at approximately 11:30 at night in Tokyo, a group of 6 employees was making their way home from work. They all worked in the dining car of one of Japan's famous bullet trains, the Shinkansen, those marvels of modern engineering that streak across the country at incredible speeds, sleek and efficient, equipped with every amenity, including restaurant cars where these 6 people spent their days serving meals and refreshments to travelers. As they walked through the city streets that night, tired from their shift, one of the young women in the group noticed something glinting on the ground beneath a public telephone booth. It was a coin, just lying there, waiting to be found. She crouched down to retrieve it, and as she did, she noticed something else. A bottle of soda, seemingly abandoned on the floor of the phone booth. The bottle appeared full, still sealed with its metal cap intact. Perhaps someone had stepped in to make a phone call and forgotten it by accident. She thought to herself how lucky she was, finding money and a perfectly good bottle of soda all at once. Being the kind person she was, she decided to give the bottle as a gift to the youngest member of their team, a 16-year-old boy we'll call Akari. Akari was a high school student who had just started this part-time job working in the train's dining car. His co-workers had taken a liking to him, treating him almost like a younger brother, buying him small gifts and treats whenever they could. He was grateful for the soda, and took it back to his dormitory with him. After arriving home around midnight, he went straight to take a bath. Around 1 in the morning, refreshed from his shower, he remembered the bottle his coworker had given him. He opened it and took a sip. Immediately, he noticed something was terribly wrong. The taste was extraordinarily bitter, harsh in a way that soda should never be. He thought perhaps the Coca-Cola had gone bad, that it had been sitting there too long and spoiled somehow. It tasted horrible, wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Alarmed, he poured the remaining liquid down the sink and rushed to the bathroom to rinse out his mouth. But it was already too late. Within minutes, he began feeling violently ill. Just 5 minutes after taking that first sip, he collapsed. Fortunately, Akari didn't live alone. His roommates discovered him unconscious on the floor and immediately called for an ambulance. He was rushed to the nearest hospital where doctors performed gastric lavage, pumping his stomach in an attempt to remove whatever poison he had ingested. But despite their efforts, at 7:30 the next morning, Akari died in the hospital's intensive care unit. How does a healthy 16-year-old boy die overnight from drinking what appeared to be a simple bottle of soda? What was inside that Coca-Cola bottle? And who had planned this young man's death? This is the story of the poisoned soda bottle murders, a series of killings that terrorized Tokyo and Osaka throughout the 1970s. Crimes that many believe were orchestrated by a single serial killer who was never caught, who disappeared into the shadows of history, leaving behind only questions, fear, and grief. If you're drawn to the unsolved mysteries that haunt Asia's past, to the cases where justice remained elusive and answers never came, subscribe to this channel. There are so many stories like this waiting to be told, each one a reminder that some darkness never sees the light. Approximately 1 hour after the 16-year-old died, at around 8:15 in the morning, another person was found unconscious on the streets of Tokyo. A middle-aged man who worked as a laborer had collapsed, just 600 meters from where the telephone booth from the first incident was located, less than a kilometer away. Passers-by who witnessed his collapse immediately called for an ambulance, and the man was transported to a hospital. But like young Akari before him, he didn't survive. Initially, police couldn't determine the man's identity, because he wasn't carrying any identification documents. They had no way of knowing who to notify about his death. He had only been carrying a small amount of money, a towel, and a beverage that wasn't Coca-Cola, but another soft drink brand. His identity was eventually discovered, because his fingerprints were registered in the police database. He was a 46-year-old man who had been missing for 13 years. The story that emerged was tragic in its own right. He had been under investigation for fraud, and apparently he had fled, leaving his family behind with no word of his whereabouts. For 13 years, his family had no news of him, no idea if he was alive or dead, no closure. They only learned what had happened to him when he died in January of 1977. But why had he died? What had killed him so suddenly on that Tokyo street? Police investigated the location where the man had collapsed and discovered residue of Coca-Cola spat out on the ground exactly where the victim was found. They also found an opened Coca-Cola bottle very near the location, once again inside a public telephone booth. At this moment, the police began to suspect that there might be a serial killer at large, using bottles of soda to murder people. Extensive tests were conducted on both victims and on the bottles found at the crime scenes. Both the 16-year-old boy and the 46-year-old man presented symptoms consistent with poisoning. Strange pinkish marks on their bodies, vomiting, and sudden unconsciousness. Investigators found sodium cyanide inside both victims' bodies and in the soda that had been consumed. Sodium cyanide is a highly poisonous compound, sometimes used as a pesticide against large animals like coyotes and foxes on farms, preventing them from preying on livestock and poultry. Even a small dose can be fatal in an extraordinarily short amount of time. According to an article from the National Library of Medicine, cyanide is rapidly absorbed. Symptoms begin within seconds after exposure, and death generally occurs in less than 30 minutes. It's not something easily obtained. You can't simply walk into a store or pharmacy and purchase cyanide. Its sale is highly regulated, and typically only large companies that use cyanide in industrial processes like mining are authorized to purchase it, as sodium cyanide is used in ore extraction. I hardly need to say that a toxic, lethal substance like this should never be anywhere near a bottle of soda. Based on the concentration found inside the bottles, police determined that whoever was responsible didn't simply want to make random strangers sick. They wanted to kill them. The amount of cyanide was more than sufficient to kill a human being. The Tokyo police acted immediately. They placed warning signs and telephone booths throughout the region, alerting people not to drink from any abandoned bottles they might find. They issued public warnings through newspapers and television, explaining what had happened and urging extreme caution. The city was gripped by fear and paranoia. How many more poisoned bottles were out there, waiting to be found by unsuspecting victims? The answer came swiftly. On January 10th, 7 days after the first deaths, another victim was found. A 25-year-old man who worked as a confectionery salesman discovered a Coca-Cola bottle at a train station in Osaka. Like the previous victims, he drank from it. Like them, he collapsed almost immediately. Unlike them, he survived, barely. He was hospitalized in critical condition, but managed to pull through after intensive treatment. He had been extraordinarily lucky, perhaps drinking less than the others, or perhaps his body responding differently to the poison. But his survival was the exception. The killer was still out there, still placing poisoned bottles in public locations, and people kept finding them, kept drinking from them, kept dying. On January 12th, another death occurred. An 18-year-old girl who worked at a company in Osaka found a bottle of Coca-Cola near a telephone booth in the city. Despite all the warnings that had been issued, despite the news coverage and the signs posted everywhere, she picked up the bottle and drank from it. She died shortly afterward. The public reaction was intense. How could someone ignore all the warnings? How could she not know about the poisoned bottles that everyone was talking about? But in her defense, the media coverage had been concentrated in Tokyo, and information didn't spread as instantly in 1977 as it does now. She may not have been aware of the full extent of the danger, or perhaps she was young and thought herself invulnerable, that such things happened to other people but not to her. Whatever her reasons, she paid for that decision with her life. The terror intensified. On January 15th, a 42-year-old man working at a tax office found yet another Coca-Cola bottle at a station in Tokyo. By this point, the warnings were everywhere, impossible to ignore. His co-workers specifically told him not to drink from it, explaining about the serial killer, about the deaths that had occurred, about the danger. But he didn't listen. He opened the bottle and drank from it anyway. When asked later why he had ignored the warnings, why he had risked his life when he'd been explicitly told not to, he reportedly said he simply didn't think it would happen to him, that the chances of finding a poisoned bottle seemed too remote to be real. He survived, but barely, spending days in the hospital recovering from cyanide poisoning. In the aftermath, he reportedly suffered from deep shame and depression. He felt humiliated for having fallen for the killer's trap, for being foolish enough to drink from an abandoned bottle when everyone knew the danger. His colleagues had warned him, and he had ignored them. He questioned how he could face people knowing he had been, in his own words, a fool. Though this death wasn't caused directly by the Coca-Cola killer, indirectly this serial murderer had claimed another life. Not through poison, but through the psychological trauma and shame that drove this man to despair. But the killer wasn't finished. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, a day meant for love and sweetness, the pattern changed slightly. A 43-year-old man who was president of a company found a bag inside Tokyo Station. This time, what was inside wasn't a bottle of soda but rather a box of chocolates. I should mention that these were specifically Glyco almond chocolates, which happens to be a popular Japanese brand. The man was aware of the poisoning cases that had occurred just a month earlier, and found the situation extremely suspicious. Rather than consuming the chocolates or simply discarding them, he wisely decided to take the bag to the police. Initially, the police didn't find anything particularly suspicious about the chocolates and simply placed them in the station's lost and found. When no one came to claim them, They eventually sent the box back to the manufacturer, Glyco. When Glyco investigated more thoroughly, they found several disturbing details. The serial number that should have been present on all chocolate boxes they manufactured had been removed and replaced. When they examined the chocolates in their laboratory, they discovered cyanide had been inserted into every individual piece. And alongside the box, the killer had left an intriguing message. "I will deliver divine justice to these proud and ugly Japanese people." This message raised troubling questions. The killer was apparently targeting Japanese people specifically, viewing the murders as some kind of justice. Did this mean the killer wasn't Japanese themselves? Was this a foreigner with a hatred of Japan? Or was it a Japanese person who felt alienated from their own society, viewing their countrymen as deserving of punishment for some perceived wrong? The message offered a glimpse into the killer's psychology, but raised more questions than it answered. Also, on February 14th, another man found a box of chocolates in the bathroom of Kanda Station, which was near Tokyo Station. Unlike the company president who had acted cautiously, this man decided to eat the chocolate. He put a piece in his mouth, and within minutes he began feeling severely ill. He was taken to the hospital where he was diagnosed with food poisoning. He regained consciousness and was released from the hospital the following day. At the time, police weren't notified because the hospital staff had diagnosed it as simple food poisoning. But when police later learned of the incident, they tracked down the man and conducted tests on the chocolates he'd consumed. They found traces of cyanide. This man had been extraordinarily lucky. Perhaps he'd eaten less. Or perhaps the cyanide concentration in that particular piece had been lower. Had he consumed more, he almost certainly would have died. Police conducted a new investigation after multiple bags of poisoned chocolates began appearing around Tokyo. At least 2 other witnesses reported seeing bags of chocolates at Tokyo Station, specifically before February 14th. The question consuming investigators was whether these cases were all connected. Was it the same killer who had poisoned the Coca-Cola bottles a month earlier now poisoning chocolates? The problem was that in that era, police had extremely limited resources to conduct the investigation. They had virtually no suspects. In the 1970s, there weren't nearly as many security cameras in public places in Japan as there are today, so they had no footage of who might have placed the bottles or chocolates. Fingerprints and DNA traces weren't found on any of the bottles or chocolate boxes. The killer had apparently thought of everything, likely wearing gloves when handling the poisoned items. What could motivate such a killer? A prominent Japanese newspaper published an article presenting at least 2 theories about the Coca-Cola killer's motivations. One theory suggested that the person behind the poisonings was likely very frustrated and lonely, deliberately choosing the beginning of the year, the first weeks of January, to commit these crimes. Perhaps this was someone who had no one to spend the year-end holidays with, who felt isolated during a time when Japanese culture emphasizes family gatherings and celebration. This loneliness might have turned to rage, prompting them to lash out at random strangers, to make others suffer as they were suffering. Perhaps they enjoyed seeing the pain of others, found satisfaction in the fear and chaos they were creating. The other theory, which I find somewhat confusing, suggested that perhaps the killer wanted to test the effects of cyanide on people, conducting experiments with various concentrations and methods. But to what end? Was the killer planning to murder a specific person eventually, and wanted to perfect their method first, using random strangers as test subjects? It seems unnecessarily elaborate and risky, but serial killers often operate according to logic that makes sense only to them. Were there any clues about the killer's identity? As mentioned earlier, sodium cyanide has many industrial applications, in printing processes, optical processing, and pesticide production. This means the person responsible for these poisonings likely had access to cyanide, and since it's not easy to purchase, they probably worked in one of these industries where cyanide is commonly used. This narrowed the suspect pool somewhat, but in a city as large as Tokyo, there were still countless possibilities. The investigation stalled, unable to identify any specific individual who fit the profile and had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit these crimes. What were the consequences of these attacks beyond the immediate deaths and injuries? Coca-Cola consumption dropped dramatically in Japan during this period. The company decided to invest in safer packaging for consumers, meaning many of those old-style bottles that opened with metal caps were replaced by cans or plastic screw-top bottles, where you could easily see if the seal had been violated. This made me reflect on how many people still prefer glass Coca-Cola bottles for their nostalgic appeal and superior taste. But they've become quite rare to find in stores. Perhaps that glass packaging with metal caps really was much less secure than the packaging we have now. making it too easy for someone to tamper with the contents without leaving obvious evidence. It has now been 47 years since these cases occurred, and the killer was never found. This remains an unsolved case, which is deeply frustrating, especially because the statute of limitations for these crimes expired in 1992. This means that even if the person responsible were caught today, assuming they're still alive, they cannot be prosecuted for their crimes. The law has granted them immunity through the simple passage of time. Somewhere out there, the Coca-Cola killer might still be alive, living an ordinary life, carrying the secret of at least 12 murders and multiple attempted murders, knowing they will never face justice for what they did. Let's pause and consider what we know about this killer from their methods and patterns. They were methodical and patient, carefully preparing each poisoned bottle or chocolate box, removing serial numbers, ensuring the containers appeared unopened and legitimate. They had access to significant quantities of cyanide, suggesting either employment in an industry that used the substance or connections to someone who had such access. They chose extremely public locations: train stations, telephone booths, places with high foot traffic where their poisoned items would likely be found quickly. This suggests they wanted relatively immediate results, that they derived satisfaction from knowing their victims would die soon after finding the bait. The choice of locations is particularly interesting. Telephone booths in the 1970s were essential infrastructure in Japanese cities, places where people stopped regularly to make calls since mobile phones didn't exist yet. By placing poisoned bottles in these booths, the killer ensured a steady stream of potential victims. People using the phone booth might notice an apparently abandoned bottle and, finding it sealed, assume it was safe to drink. Train stations served a similar purpose. Busy hubs where thousands of people pass through daily, where a bag of chocolates left on a bench or in a bathroom might be found by someone thinking they'd gotten lucky. There's a particular cruelty in this method of murder. The killer wasn't confronting their victims directly, wasn't even present when death occurred. They were creating death traps and walking away, letting random chance determine who would live and who would die. It's the work of someone who viewed other human beings as fundamentally expendable, as objects in an experiment, rather than people with families, dreams, and futures. The randomness is part of what made it so terrifying. Anyone could be a victim. There was no way to know who the killer wanted to hurt because they didn't want to hurt anyone specific. They wanted to hurt everyone. The message left with the Valentine's Day chocolates about delivering divine justice to proud and ugly Japanese people offers the only real glimpse into the killer's mindset. The phrase divine justice suggests they viewed themselves as some kind of righteous avenger, correcting perceived wrongs through murder. The description of Japanese people as proud and ugly reveals deep resentment, possibly stemming from feelings of rejection or mistreatment. If the killer was Japanese, this message suggests profound alienation from their own culture and people. If they were foreign, it indicates a hatred of Japan and Japanese people that had festered into murderous rage. But why chocolates on Valentine's Day specifically? In Japan, Valentine's Day is primarily a day when women give chocolates to men, either as romantic gestures or as obligatory gifts to male colleagues and acquaintances. By poisoning chocolates on this particular day, was the killer making some statement about romantic relationships or gender dynamics? Or was it simply opportunistic? Valentine's Day meant lots of chocolate would be circulating, making poisoned boxes less likely to seem suspicious. We can only speculate. The victims themselves deserve to be remembered as more than just statistics in an unsolved case. 16-year-old Akari was just beginning his adult life, working a part-time job while attending high school, liked by his co-workers who treated him kindly and looked after him. He had dreams and plans for the future that were all erased because he drank from a bottle given to him as a gift by someone who cared about him. The 46-year-old man who'd been missing for 13 years, who'd been living under the radar for over a decade, finally reconnecting with his identity only in death. What might his life have become if he'd survived that morning? The 18-year-old girl in Osaka, young and perhaps careless but not deserving of death for a moment's poor judgment. All of them were simply living their lives when they encountered random evil in the form of a bottle or a box left by a stranger who wanted them dead. The survivors carry their own burdens. Those who drank the poison and lived must grapple with the knowledge of how close they came to death. How random chance, drinking less, seeking medical care faster, some quirk of individual physiology, saved them when others died. And there's the man who ignored his co-workers' warnings, who drank from the bottle despite knowing the danger, and whose survival was overshadowed by shame and depression. His story is particularly poignant because it illustrates how the killer's actions created ripples of suffering that extended far beyond those who were physically poisoned. The investigation consumed vast resources and involved numerous police departments across multiple cities, yet ultimately led nowhere. Detectives followed every lead, interviewed countless people who worked in industries with access to cyanide, analyzed the bottles and chocolates for any trace evidence that might identify the killer. But whoever did this was careful, intelligent, and either lucky or skilled enough to leave no trail. They stopped suddenly. The last known case was the Valentine's Day chocolates in February 1977, and then nothing. Did the killer die? Move away from Japan? Get arrested for an unrelated crime? Simply decide they'd had enough? We'll probably never know. The statute of limitations expiring in 1992 meant that even if new evidence emerged, even if someone came forward with information that definitively identified the killer, no prosecution could proceed. Japanese law at the time had these limitations for all crimes except murder in certain contexts. This has since changed. Murder no longer has a statute of limitations in Japan, but the change came too late for the victims of the Coca-Cola killer. Justice remains forever out of reach. There's something particularly haunting about cases like this, where the perpetrator simply vanishes into history. They succeeded completely, killed multiple people, terrorized an entire city, and got away with it. They're out there somewhere, or they were until they died of natural causes, carrying their secret. Maybe they told someone on their deathbed. Maybe they kept it locked inside forever. Maybe they felt remorse in their later years, or maybe they felt nothing at all. We can't know, and that not knowing is part of what makes this case so disturbing. For the families of the victims, there's no closure. They know how their loved ones died, but not who killed them, or why. They can't even take comfort in knowing the killer was punished, because the killer never faced any consequences. The investigation eventually went cold, and life moved on, as it always does. But the grief remains, as does the anger at a justice system that let time run out before answers could be found. This case changed Japan in small but significant ways. It made people more cautious about accepting food or drink from unknown sources. It prompted changes in packaging that made tampering more obvious. It became part of the cultural memory, a cautionary tale that parents might tell children about why you don't consume things you find lying around. These small ripples are all that remain of crimes that once dominated headlines and kept an entire nation on edge. As we reflect on the poisoned bottle murders nearly 5 decades later, we're reminded that not every mystery gets solved. Not every killer gets caught. Not every story has a satisfying ending. Sometimes evil wins simply by being patient and careful enough. Sometimes people get away with murder, literally, and the only justice that exists is in the remembering, in refusing to let the victims be forgotten, even when their killer remains unknown. If this unsolved mystery has captured your imagination, if you find yourself drawn to the cases that remain open, where questions outnumber answers, then subscribe to this channel. There are so many more stories like this across Asia, mysteries that have never been solved, crimes that have never been punished, secrets that remain locked away. Each one is worth remembering, worth examining, worth keeping alive in our collective memory. Because in the act of remembering, in the telling of these stories, we grant the victims a kind of immortality, ensuring they remain more than just statistics in old police files. They were people who lived and laughed and had futures stolen from them by someone who was never made to answer for what they did. May their stories continue to be told, and may we never forget that some mysteries remain forever in shadow, waiting for light that may never come.